Everyone knows Quetzalcoatlus. With its length roughly the height of a giraffe and a wingspan of 36 feet, it is considered the largest flying animal that has ever lived on Earth. But there is something you don't know. Quetzalcoatlus may not be the largest flying animal that ever lived. Because Hateg Island still holds its mystery, about 66 million years ago, Quetzalcoatlus lived on an island called Hateg. At that time, the Earth was filled with giants. On land, enormous theropods and sauropods reigned, while in the oceans, gigantic mosasaurs roamed. So wherever you turned your head, you would definitely see a giant. However, things were a bit different on Hateg Island. On this island, you couldn't see a giant wherever you turned your head, because there was only one family that held a monopoly on gigantism, Esdarkady, of which Quetzalcoatlus was also a member. Therefore, wherever you turn your head, you would always see the same family. This family had reached such gigantic sizes that even the dinosaurs on the island looked like dwarves next to them. And the terrifying part was that Quetzalcoatlus was not the only giant in this family. There was another member of this family that lived at the same time. It was probably even larger than Quetzalcoatlus, and perhaps it was the largest flying animal the sky had ever seen. This was Hatzegopteryx. If there were a winged T-Rex, it would undoubtedly be Hatzegopteryx. Its bones were so large and robust that no one would believe they belonged to a flying animal. This is why paleontologists initially thought these bones belonged to a new species of theropod when they were first discovered. But they were wrong, because the situation was much more different than they thought. It was the late 1970s. A group of students was conducting an excavation in the Transylvania region of Western Romania. Their aim was to find fossilized pterosaur bones. At that time, researchers knew that this region was once part of an ancient island millions of years ago. Over the years, many fossils had been unearthed from these lands. However, none of them were truly extraordinary, so the excavation team thought they had found ordinary bones. Yet, unknowingly, they had discovered the bones of one of the most extraordinary pterosaurs in history. The first pieces found belonged to the back part of a skull and a wing bone. The interesting thing was that these bones did not resemble the pterosaur bones we know at all. They should have been thin and fragile, but instead they were thick, heavy, and incredibly robust. That is why, as I just mentioned, these bones were initially thought to belong to a carnivorous dinosaur. However, as the excavations continued, new bones began to emerge. First a femur, then another gigantic jawbone was found. At that moment, the researchers realized that the fossils they had were not ordinary and decided to examine the bones in detail. As a result of the examinations, they soon realized that these bones actually belonged to a giant pterosaur. Now I can guess the question on your mind. Okay, but how could such heavy and robust bones belong to an animal that could actually fly? The answer to this question lies on Hateg Island, because Hatzegopteryx's impossible size was actually dependent on the place it lived. About 66 million years ago, Europe was not a single continent as we know it today. It was a vast archipelago made up of hundreds of islands, scattered across the middle of a boundless ocean. And one of these islands was Hateg Island, which hosted one of the most extraordinary ecosystems in history. This island, thought to be about the size of present-day Ireland, was surrounded on all sides by open ocean, approximately 300 kilometers across. In other words, for millions of years, it remained almost completely isolated from the outside world. And this is exactly what made Hatzegopteryx's impossible size possible. This island, which had no connection with the outside world, had its own unique ecosystem. In this confined area of about 80,000 square kilometers, food resources were quite limited. Therefore, this scarcity caused the animals on the island to shrink over time. In paleontology, this is called insular dwarfism. That is, many species on the island gradually became smaller to adapt to limited resources and survive with lower energy requirements. But for Hatzegopteryx, this rule did not apply. Unlike the dwarfing animals, this giant winged predator experienced what could be called insular gigantism, because there were no giant theropods on this island. There were no apex predators. In other words, Hatzegopteryx had no rivals. Moreover, there were plenty of food sources on the island for Hatzegopteryx. I am talking about the unfortunate dwarf dinosaurs. Therefore, all these advantages led to Hatzegopteryx growing boundlessly. So how could an animal with such heavy bones soar through the sky? In flying animals, the center of gravity is vital. That is why the heaviest body parts of today's birds are located right under the wings. Their heads are as small as possible. This way, both weight balance is maintained and air resistance during flight is minimized. For this reason, most pterosaur skulls also consist of thin plates and supports. However, Hatzegopteryx was completely outside these rules. Its skull alone was about 3 meters long. This made it the species with the largest skull among all pterosaurs discovered to date. Moreover, if you noticed, this gigantic head was almost equivalent in size to Hatzegopteryx's body. In other words, according to the laws of physics, it was impossible for Hatzegopteryx to fly. Indeed, paleontologists also thought that Hatzegopteryx's gigantic skull needed to be lightened for it to fly. However, although this animal's skull was thick and robust, interestingly, it also contained many cavities and hollows. This essentially meant that the bones were less heavy than they appeared. These cavities and hollows made the bones appear strong and flexible, while also making them much lighter than they looked. If you have come this far in the video, you can leave a bone emoji in the comments as a tribute to Hatzegopteryx, or if you want to support me directly, you can subscribe to my channel. In fact, this structure is likened by paleontologists to expanded polystyrene, in other words, styrofoam. So it was actually hollow on the inside, light, and yet quite durable. In addition, not only the skull, but also the wing bones had the same hollow structure. This is a unique feature almost never seen in other pterosaurs. In other words, Hatzegopteryx had become an evolutionary engineering marvel, as if to be able to fly. Still, with a body like a tank, it was difficult for this animal to take off easily. Like all pterosaurs, Hatzegopteryx took off from the ground differently than birds. Birds jump with their 2 legs to fly, and some even have to run to take off. Pterosaurs, as suggested by experts Dr. Mark Witten and Dr. Michael Habib working on Prehistoric Planet, took off using a quadrupedal launch technique. With their muscular forelimbs and chest muscles, they could launch their light bodies into the air and generate lift. Thanks to more energy-efficient flight methods, pterosaurs were not subject to the same body size and shape limitations as birds. This allowed them to reach gigantic body sizes. Their flight muscles weighed 50 kilograms, and this constituted 20–25% of Hatzegopteryx's total body mass. Once upon a time, scientists thought that thanks to its hollow bone structure, Hatzegopteryx could fly for long distances without stopping. But recent research has considerably shaken this romantic picture. It seems that this giant's stature did not allow it to be a long-range marathon runner at all. On the contrary, Hatzegopteryx was more like a breathless sprinter. It would launch into the air briefly, flap its wings, but then immediately had to land somewhere and rest. You might say, if it was only going to stay in the air for a short time, why did this animal have wings? Probably to survey its prey from above and to more easily traverse its kingdom, Hateg Island. Being the largest predator on the island was already a privilege in itself, but being able to soar above this obstacle-ridden island on top of that was a true advantage against other animals. Because the terrain of Hateg Island was not easy at all, it was covered with dense forests. This meant moving on land was quite difficult, especially for large animals. Moreover, the dozens of rivers and streams scattered among these dense thickets were like a labyrinth drawn by nature. Being able to easily overcome these natural barriers with a few wing beats instead of struggling on the ground made Hatzegopteryx not just a predator, but also the undisputed ruler of this challenging geography. Despite everything, this magnificent pterosaur was largely ignored for a long time after its discovery, a full 30 years. Finally, in 2002, it was named Hatzegopteryx thambima. It means monster of the Hateg Basin. As its name suggests, the Hateg part comes from Hateg Island, where this gigantic pterosaur lived millions of years ago. The thambima part was a reference to its completely surprising and unimaginable size. In short, its name referred to both the place it lived and its size. Now let's get to the topic everyone is eagerly waiting for: How big was this animal? To calculate this, paleontologists first compared Hatzegopteryx's wing bone with Quetzalcoatlus' wing bone. According to the comparison, they suggested that Hatzegopteryx's wing bone might be slightly longer than that of the famous Quetzal. At that time, Quetzalcoatlus' wingspan was known to be about 11 to 12 meters or 36 to 39 feet. So according to this calculation, Hatzegopteryx's wingspan should have been longer than a 12-meter wingspan. But things changed in 2010. With their detailed study, Mark Witten and Michael Habib revealed that this giant could not actually surpass Quetzalcoatlus in wingspan. Why? Because the crushing and distortions that Hatzegopteryx's wing bone had been exposed to over millions of years had not been taken into account in the initial calculations. Today, including the crushing and distortions, the current wingspan of this animal is accepted as 10 to 11 meters, or 32 to 36 feet. At this point, it is worth noting that big is a somewhat vague word. Therefore, scientific sources generally consider the species with the highest mass as the largest. The coast redwood and the giant sequoia are a very good example of this. The coast redwood, with its height reaching up to 120 meters, is the tallest tree species in the world. The giant sequoia, although shorter than the coast redwood at 85 meters tall, is considered the largest tree in the world due to its gigantic and thick trunk structure. Now, at this point, we can provide a scientific explanation for the debate on whether Hatzegopteryx or Quetzalcoatlus was larger. First, let's take a look at Hatzegopteryx's body structure. Hatzegopteryx's neck length is relatively shorter when compared to Quetzalcoatlus. Hatzegopteryx's neck was about 1.5 meters long, while Quetzalcoatlus's neck was about 3 meters long. In short, Hatzegopteryx's neck was short and stocky. However, as a result of robust and thick-walled vertebrae, Hatzegopteryx's neck was much heavier and stronger than Quetzalcoatlus's neck. In fact, Hatzegopteryx's gigantic neck vertebrae had led paleontologists to make larger length estimates for Hatzegopteryx. But this was a major fallacy, because in these types of giant pterosaurs, the neck vertebrae are almost always larger and more robust than the other vertebrae, just like the thickening of the neck in some animals to support the weight of the head. Ultimately, it can be said that Quetzalcoatlus was longer than Hatzegopteryx thanks to its long neck. Estimates suggest that Quetzalcoatlus was approximately 5.5 meters long, or 18 feet. Hatzegopteryx's length is estimated to be about 5 meters. Their wingspans are similar in value, but considering Quetzalcoatlus's light and graceful structure, it can be said to be a longer distance flyer than Hatzegopteryx. Therefore, Quetzalcoatlus had a larger wingspan. Now let's get to the most critical point. How much did these animals weigh? As I mentioned earlier, Hatzegopteryx had a broader skull and a thicker neck. Although its wingspan and length are shorter than Quetzalcoatlus due to its tank-like robust structure, Hatzegopteryx was heavier than Quetzalcoatlus. This weight is estimated to be between 225 to 250 kilograms for Hatzegopteryx, while it is estimated to be between 180 to 200 kilograms for Quetzalcoatlus. So, by definition, Hatzegopteryx was a larger animal than Quetzalcoatlus. This gives it the title of the largest flying animal that ever lived. Furthermore, Hatzegopteryx's posterior neck vertebrae were so strong that they could withstand loads up to 5 to 10 times their own body weight. That is, this giant not only carried its huge head with its neck, but could also effortlessly withstand the immense force generated when tearing apart its prey. When these extraordinarily strong vertebrae combine with that enormous skull and jaw structure, it brought an interesting idea to paleontologists' minds. Could this monster have been a different kind of predator than its other flying cousins? According to their estimates, Hatzegopteryx was challenging prey too large to swallow whole. Its gigantic beak was its main weapon, and it is thought to have killed its large prey by violently stabbing or crushing them, using its beak like a spear. The dwarf dinosaurs living on Hateg Island at that time, whether juveniles or adults, were at the top of this nightmare's menu. In fact, not just them. Other flightless dinosaurs also inevitably became targets. But what truly made Hatzegopteryx frightening was not just that it was a dinosaur hunter. Paleontologists describe it as a terrestrial generalist opportunist. That is, It spent most of its time on the ground using its wings, as I said before, to traverse the island or for short distance attacks. In short, this giant pterosaur was the terror of not just the skies, but also the lands. The population of Hateg Island was actually quite crowded, but they all lived under the shadow of Hatzegopteryx. Here, there were many dwarf dinosaurs with their own unique names, herbivores like Megarosaurus, Pallididitin, Telmatosaurus, Zalmoxes, and Struthiosaurus, and their carnivorous cousins like Bradignum, Elopteryx, and Heptistornis. But the island wasn't just made up of these dinosaurs. Crocodilomorphs, a strange bird called Gargantuavis, primitive relatives of mammals, and even salamanders, frogs, and an as yet unnamed snake were also part of this ecosystem. When we look at the sky, we also see other pterosaurs. So far, 3 distinct Esdarkid species have been identified here, with wingspans ranging from 3.5 meters to 5 meters. But these numbers are truly dwarfed next to the gigantic wings of Hatzegopteryx. None of them even come close to its size. This means that Hatzegopteryx was the undisputed largest, most fearless carnivore on both the land and the sky of the island. It was essentially a sole apex predator. And among all this crowd, it is estimated that a subtropical climate prevailed at that time, with Europe being much warmer than it is today. Now, was there parental care among pterosaurs? Although no egg or embryo remains belonging to Hatzegopteryx have been found yet, according to an article published in the journal Science in 2023, hundreds of fossilized pterosaur eggs were found in northwestern China. And the most exciting part was that 16 of these eggs contained partial embryo remains. The eggs were quite interesting, about 7.2 centimeters long, elongated oval in shape, and had a thin, hard outer shell. But this shell was full of cracks and fissures, and on the inside, there was a thick membrane layer. That is, they resembled the eggs of some snakes and lizards today. Moreover, hundreds of adult male, female, and even juvenile fossils belonging to the species Homipteris were also unearthed at the excavation site. According to the evidence, baby pterosaurs belonging to large species like Hatzegopteryx could not fly when they were born, and like some of today's birds, they needed parental care. Embryonic bones show that in juvenile pterosaurs, the hind limbs developed faster than vital bones like the humerus, which would form the wings. Small species are also estimated to have needed parental care. They either had to mature quickly and fend for themselves, or they succumbed to other challenges of nature during this process. While the young of some small species seem to be born ready to fly almost immediately after hatching, the young of giant species spent a long time on the ground, in the nest, until their wings strengthened. Right now, like everyone watching this video, crazy questions are running through my mind. Did Hatzegopteryx incubate its eggs by sitting on them? Did they protect the young from predators? Did they bring food and feed their young? All these questions are currently unanswered. Hopefully, one day in a lucky excavation, we will come across a tiny Hatzegopteryx egg or juvenile. Additionally, Hatzegopteryx's external appearance is thought to have been quite colorful, like in modern birds. Indeed, when we first saw Hatzegopteryx in Prehistoric Planet, we were not faced with an ordinary monster. Hatzegopteryx looked like it had stepped out of a costume ball. Moreover, the species we saw in Prehistoric Planet was male. All this colorfulness, of course, had a reason to impress the females. The differences between the males and females of these giants are not fully known, but such distinctions are quite common in other pterosaurs. According to Naish, the crests in Esdarkids evolved for display purposes anyway, and the color pigments in these crests also support this theory. Hatzegopteryx's vibrant colors might have been an ornament specific to the breeding season, just like the seasonal breeding plumage we see in lizards or birds today. You have probably heard Hatzegopteryx's crocodile-like hisses and deep guttural sounds in Prehistoric Planet. According to Dr. Darren Naish, Esdarkids were not like typical screaming birds. They produced more airy, booming, resonant sounds. It is thought that with its stocky build, Hatzegopteryx produced these sounds in a thicker, fuller tone compared to Quetzalcoatlus, like a double bass. Unfortunately, this magnificent reign did not last forever, because the final act of the Cretaceous was cut short by a gigantic rock from the sky. That asteroid impact was so violent that it devastated life all around the world. This catastrophe, 66 million years ago, swept away not only Hatzegopteryx, but also the dwarf dinosaurs that lived alongside it, the feared predators of the oceans like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, and everyone else. All non-avian dinosaurs, the last giants of the sky, and many more creatures became victims of this dark day. 3/4 of the planet fell silent. That tropical paradise suddenly darkened under a massive blanket of ash. But nature abhors a vacuum. Even millions of years after Hatzegopteryx had long turned to dust, evolution rewrote the same story in different geographies. When suitable conditions arose, other large flying predators also took on a similar apex predator role. For instance, in the Gargano region of Italy, which was an island at that time due to high sea levels, gigantic barn owls roosted. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, extinct giant storks similarly became the fear of the island. But perhaps the most striking example was the Haast's eagle, which lived on the South Island of New Zealand. This giant, the largest eagle that ever lived, was the undisputed apex predator of the island and fed on giant moa birds. That was until Maori hunters set foot on the island in the 13th century. As the Maoris hunted and consumed the moas, the Haast's eagle also met its end. So nature actually produced many Hatzegopteryxes at different times. They all reigned in their own age, and when conditions changed, only their bones remained. Thank you for watching. Let me know you've made it this far in the video by leaving a wing emoji in the comments. You can also support me by subscribing to my channel. See you soon.